Bruce Lee had understood this problem with rigid, unverified martial arts systems at the beginning of his philosophical journey. His entire philosophy of Jeet Kune Do was built on a single premise. If it hasn't been tested under realistic pressure, you don't actually know if it works. Seagal's world, impressive as it was in its own context, had never been seriously pressure tested. And the people who trained with Bruce Lee knew this. Instantly. What happened when these two worlds finally intersected was perhaps inevitable, but no one could have predicted how public the consequences would become. Bruce Lee died on July 20th, 1973. He was 32 years old. The official cause of death was cerebral edema, swelling of the brain, triggered by a hypersensitivity reaction to a prescription painkiller. He was found unresponsive in actress Betty Ting Pei's Hong Kong apartment. He never regained consciousness. He left behind a wife, 2 children, an unfinished film, and a legacy that would grow larger with every passing decade. He also left behind a tightly knit community of people who had trained with him, learned from him, been changed by him. People who carried his philosophy forward with a fierce, almost familial loyalty. These were not casual students. Dan Inosanto, who Lee had personally authorized to teach Jeet Kune Do, became the primary keeper of Lee's technical legacy. Taiki Kimura, Lee's first student in Seattle, continued teaching into old age. Ted Wong, who trained with Lee in his final years, was considered by many to have received Lee's most evolved technical instruction. These men moved through the martial arts world of the 1970s and 1980s, quietly watching as martial arts exploded in American popular culture, watching as strip mall dojos multiplied across the country, watching as action movies created a new category of celebrity fighter, watching as men built careers on carefully packaged images of deadly competence. They watched with a particular kind of skepticism, because they had felt the real thing. They knew what it looked like. And when someone's image didn't match the reality they had experienced firsthand, they noticed. By the late 1980s, Steven Seagal had become the dominant martial arts action star in Hollywood. Above the Law in 1988 had launched him into the stratosphere. Hard to Kill, Marked for Death, Out for Justice followed in rapid succession. He was selling a very specific image, a quiet, impossibly dangerous man with supernatural combat abilities. A man for whom violence was never theatrical, but always lethal and precise. Audiences loved it. The people who had trained with Bruce Lee watched it with growing unease. Now we arrive at the story that has circulated for 40 years. The details vary depending on the source. Some say it happened in 1991. Others place it slightly earlier. But the core of what occurred, documented through multiple independent witness accounts that have remained remarkably consistent across decades, points to a single, defining confrontation that Seagal has never been able to fully escape. The location was a film production, ENVIRONMENT in Los Angeles. The specific circumstances involved Seagal demonstrating Aikido techniques to crew members, a performance he was well known for on sets, using his physical size and Aikido credentials to establish dominance in professional environments. Present that day was a man named Gene LeBell. If Bruce Lee was the philosopher king of American martial arts in the 1960s, Gene LeBell was its battle-hardened enforcer. LeBell had been training in combat sports since childhood. He had won the National Judo Championship in 1954. He had competed in professional wrestling. He had worked as a stuntman and stunt coordinator in Hollywood for decades. He was, by any objective measure, one of the most practically tested fighters in American history. LeBell had also trained with Bruce Lee. He and Lee had worked together, exchanged techniques, and developed a mutual respect built on the foundation that both men valued: actual, tested, pressure-verified ability. When LaBelle encountered Seagal that day, what happened next became one of the most talked about incidents in Hollywood martial arts history. Seagal, according to multiple witnesses, made a claim that he could not be choked unconscious, that his training and neck conditioning made him immune to chokeholds. This was the kind of claim that flows naturally from an Aikido background, where such scenarios are not regularly trained against in realistic conditions. LaBelle, a man who had applied chokeholds in actual competition against fully resisting opponents for 40 years, heard this claim and responded the way any honest practitioner would respond. He offered to test it. What happened next? Witnesses described with remarkable consistency. LaBelle applied a rear naked choke, a technique he had used successfully in actual competition countless times. Seagal, despite his size advantage, found himself unable to counter it. The choke was fully effective. Seagal lost consciousness. When he regained it, witnesses reported he had lost control of his bowels. This incident, embarrassing, revealing, fundamentally human, spread through the Hollywood stunt community and martial arts underground with the speed of a wildfire. Within weeks, the story had reached every corner of the industry. Within months, it was legend. Seagal denied it, then partially denied it, then offered carefully worded statements that neither confirmed nor fully refuted the incident. Over the years, he settled into a position of aggressive dismissal, calling LaBelle a liar, threatening legal action, insisting the events described never occurred. LaBelle's response was characteristically blunt. He confirmed the story. In multiple interviews over multiple years, he described what happened with the calm consistency of a man telling the truth. He never embellished. He never changed details. He simply described what occurred. The martial arts community, whose members include thousands of practitioners with the technical knowledge to evaluate competing claims, overwhelmingly believed LaBelle. But here is where Bruce Lee enters the story directly. Because this incident wasn't just about Seagal and LaBelle. It was about a philosophical divide that Bruce Lee had spent his entire life trying to resolve. In 1967, Bruce Lee gave a lecture at the Ed Parker Long Beach International Karate Championships that has since become foundational text in combat sports philosophy. He talked about the difference between performing techniques and using them. He described practitioners who had never been hit in the face, never felt genuine resistance, never experienced the physiological reality of adrenaline and fear, and an opponent who actively wants to hurt you. He called this the difference between dry land swimming and actual swimming. The movement might look similar from a distance, but the moment you enter water, the gap between simulation and reality becomes catastrophic. Bruce Lee had designed Jeet Kune Do specifically around the problem that destroyed Seagal in that room with Jean LaBelle. He had understood decades earlier that any martial art trained exclusively in cooperative environments, where partners fall on cue, where techniques are never tested against genuine resistance, creates a kind of competence hallucination. The practitioner feels capable. They can execute techniques perfectly in the dojo, but the techniques have never been stress-tested against the variable that makes everything different: an opponent who refuses to cooperate. People who trained with Lee have described specific sessions that illustrate this. Lee would put his students in situations of genuine discomfort, real pressure, real resistance, real uncertainty about what was coming. Not because he wanted to hurt them, but because he understood that comfortable training creates comfortable delusions. Lee's training partner and student, Bob Wall, described drills where Lee would attack with genuine speed and intention, where the only way to survive was to actually figure out the solution in real time. Wall, a tournament champion himself, described coming away from these sessions with a completely revised understanding of what he actually knew versus what he merely believed he knew. This was the philosophical abyss that swallowed Seagal in front of Jean LaBelle. he believed he knew. He had never been forced to discover what he actually knew. There is a story that has circulated in Hollywood's martial arts underground for 4 decades. A story that Steven Seagal has never fully confirmed. A story that witnesses swear happened exactly as they describe. A story about the moment a living legend encountered a man who would build his entire career on a carefully constructed myth, and what happened when those two realities collided. But to understand that story, you have to understand the world that created both men. Because Bruce Lee and Steven Seagal didn't just represent two fighters. They represented two completely different philosophies of what a martial artist is, what a warrior stands for, and most critically, what happens when ego refuses to bow to reality. The year is 1964, San Francisco. The world of American martial arts is a closed, insular universe, dominated by rigid traditions, secretive masters, and an unspoken code. You don't share your techniques with outsiders. Japanese styles stayed Japanese. Chinese styles stayed Chinese. The idea of blending disciplines was considered heresy. Into this world walked a 23-year-old Chinese American with a dangerous idea. Bruce Lee had already been fighting his entire life, not just in the physical sense, but against every wall that American society put in front of him. Hollywood wouldn't cast him as a lead. Martial arts traditionalists called his philosophy disrespectful. Racist immigration laws had shaped the very world he grew up in. And yet, in every room he entered, Bruce Lee had a quality that witnesses still struggle to describe, an absolute unshakable certainty in his own abilities. He called his philosophy Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. It wasn't a style, it was the rejection of style. Take what works, discard what doesn't. Adapt in real time. In 1964, this idea was revolutionary. Most martial artists would have laughed if they weren't so quietly terrified of what it implied about their own traditions. Meanwhile, in Lansing, Michigan, a teenage boy named Steven Seagal was watching kung fu movies and dreaming of something different, something bigger. He would later claim he moved to Japan at age 17, became the first foreigner to operate an Aikido dojo in Japan, and trained under legendary masters. He would build an entire identity on these claims. He would become, on paper, one of the most decorated martial artists in Hollywood history. But here is where the story gets complicated. Because not everything Steven Seagal has ever said about himself has been verified. And the men who knew Bruce Lee, who trained with him, fought beside him, watched him move, would eventually encounter Seagal's world. What they saw left them deeply skeptical. Piki bu iki adam neden berbiranen tam karsasanda duruyordu. Bu sarunan savabi, 1991 deki, o karamliko data seklida. But wait. Before we get to that room, we need to understand something crucial about Bruce Lee that most people don't know. Something that changed everything. Most people think they know Bruce Lee. They think of the flying kicks, the battle cry, the films Enter the Dragon, Fists of Fury, The Way of the Dragon. They think of a movie star who happened to know some martial arts, a charismatic performer who made fighting look cinematic. They are wrong. The real Bruce Lee was something far more dangerous, far more disciplined, and far more complex than any film could capture. And to understand the Seagal story, you have to first understand who Bruce Lee actually was, because the contrast between Lee's authentic mastery and Seagal's manufactured mythology is what makes the eventual collision so devastating. Bruce Lee began his formal martial arts training under the legendary Ip Man in Hong Kong at age 13. Wing Chun, the style he first learned, is a close-range, economical fighting system built on simultaneous attack and defense, centerline theory, and devastating efficiency. Under Ip Man, Lee didn't just learn techniques. He absorbed principles. He began to understand the geometry of combat, But Bruce Lee was constitutionally incapable of stopping at one discipline. He obsessively studied boxing films, particularly Muhammad Ali and Sugar Ray Robinson. He analyzed footwork, timing, head movement, the mechanics of how elite boxers created and closed distance. He incorporated wrestling. He studied fencing and applied its concepts to hand-to-hand range management. He trained in judo. He experimented with techniques from multiple Southeast Asian fighting systems. Here is what made this unusual. In 1960s America, what Bruce Lee was doing had no name. Mixed martial arts as a concept didn't exist. Cross-training was considered disloyal to your style. Bruce Lee was essentially inventing modern combat sports methodology, 20 years before the UFC would prove him right. Filmmaker and martial artist Dan Inosanto, one of Lee's most trusted students, described training sessions that left him feeling physically inadequate despite his own exceptional abilities. Chuck Norris, at the time one of the most decorated American karate competitors alive, trained with Bruce Lee and openly stated that Lee's speed was unlike anything he had ever encountered in competition. These were not polite compliments. These were men who had spent their lives in martial arts. Men who had nothing to gain from exaggeration. Men who described Bruce Lee with the same consistent language, impossibly fast, technically precise, intellectually ahead of everyone around him, and possessed of a physical conditioning that bordered on the inhuman. Lee's training regimen was legendary. He ran miles daily. He performed hundreds of push-ups and sit-ups every morning before most people had opened their eyes. He had developed forearm strength through specialized exercises that left his arms visually extraordinary. He experimented with nutrition and supplementation decades before these concepts entered mainstream fitness culture. His body fat, measured repeatedly, hovered around 3%, a figure that elite athletes today achieve only at peak competition. And beneath all of this physical preparation was a philosophical framework that set Bruce Lee apart from every fighter of his era. He read voraciously. Philosophy, psychology, physics. He annotated books on Zen Buddhism and applied their concepts to martial arts training. His personal library contained hundreds of volumes, and he didn't just read them. He wrote in the margins, debated with the authors, synthesized ideas across disciplines. When Bruce Lee walked into a room full of martial artists, the people who understood what they were looking at felt something shift. Not fear, exactly. Something more fundamental. The recognition that they were in the presence of someone operating at a genuinely different level. Now, understand all of this. Hold it clearly in your mind. Because now we need to talk about Steven Seagal. Steven Frederick Seagal was born in Lansing, Michigan. In 1952. He would grow into a large, physically imposing man, over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered with an intense, almost hypnotic screen presence. He would study Aikido with genuine dedication. He would eventually earn a 7th Dan black belt in Aikido, a real credential from a real organization, representing real years of training. None of this is in dispute. What is in dispute, what has been questioned, challenged, and methodically dismantled by journalists, former students, and martial arts practitioners over the course of 4 decades, is the vast mythology that Seagal constructed around these real accomplishments. He claimed to have lived in Japan from age 17. Independent verification of this timeline has proven elusive. He claimed to have been the first foreigner to operate a dojo in Japan, a claim that Japanese martial arts historians have challenged. He claimed connections to intelligence agencies, to Japanese crime figures he supposedly helped bring down, to special forces training operations that have never been documented. He claimed in various interviews over the years to have been involved in real combat situations that colleagues and witnesses have contradicted. But here is the critical distinction. Seagal's Aikido credentials were legitimate. Aikido is a genuine martial art, with genuine technical demands, and Seagal's proficiency in it was real. The problem, and this is a problem that goes to the Heart of the eventual conflict with Bruce Lee's world is what Aikido is and what it isn't. Aikido was developed by Morihei Ueshiba in the early 20th century as a martial discipline emphasizing harmony, joint manipulation, throws, and redirection of force rather than direct confrontation. It is a beautiful art. It contains genuine self-defense principles. At high levels, it requires sophisticated understanding of balance, body mechanics, and timing. But Aikido has a profound limitation that practitioners and critics have debated for decades. It is almost entirely trained in cooperative environments. Uke, the attacker, is expected to fall when thrown. Techniques are drilled against committed, stylized attacks. The resistance training that combat sports use to pressure test techniques is largely absent. And the ghost of Bruce Lee, the philosophy that Lee had embedded in every student, every instructor, every practitioner who carried Jeet Kune Do forward, had just exposed that gap in the most public, most humiliating, most permanent way possible. After the LaBelle incident, a different Steven Seagal began to emerge in public. Where once he had been willing to engage in technical discussions about combat, to accept challenges, to position himself as a genuine martial artist who could hold his own with anyone, he became increasingly guarded. Interviews about his martial arts background became exercises in careful deflection. Questions about his claimed real-world combat experience were met with legal threats or silence. He leaned harder into the mythology. Claims about CIA connections deepened. Stories about underworld contacts and special operations experience became more elaborate. He began spending more time in Russia, cultivating relationships with political figures there, constructing an international identity that placed him beyond the reach of domestic accountability. The action films continued. Though their box office returns declined steadily through the 1990s, by the early 2000s, Seagal had migrated primarily to direct-to-video productions, a trajectory that observers of Hollywood's action genre noted with the particular sadness reserved for watching a carefully maintained illusion finally fail. But here is what is important. None of this diminished the fundamental questions about what had happened with Jean LaBelle. The incident remained. The witnesses remained. The testimony remained consistent and detailed. Year after year, and against it, Seagal offered only denial. The contrast with Bruce Lee, a man whose entire philosophy was built on honest self-assessment, on the willingness to be wrong, on the courage to test yourself in conditions where failure was possible, could not have been more complete. Lee had said, repeatedly and explicitly, that the man who claims to know everything knows nothing. That the first step toward real mastery was the honest recognition of your own limitations. He had written in his personal journals about the discipline required to admit weakness, to seek out the training partners and scenarios that exposed gaps rather than confirmed existing beliefs. Seagal chose the opposite path. When reality contradicted the image, he protected the image. For 4 decades, the LaBelle incident lived in the martial arts underground. It was the kind of story told in dojos after class, in gyms between rounds, in the green rooms of action film productions where stunt performers gathered and spoke honestly about the enormous distance between Hollywood fighting and real fighting. But gradually, it began surfacing in more public venues. In interviews, LaBelle maintained his account with the unhurried certainty of a man who had absolutely nothing to fear from the truth. He was past 80 years old. He had been inducted into multiple martial arts halls of fame. His reputation was built on a lifetime of actual, documented, verifiable competitive achievement. What possible motive could he have for fabricating an embarrassing story about a Hollywood celebrity? Other witnesses began corroborating the account. People who had been present that day, or who had heard directly from those who were, described what happened in terms that aligned with LaBelle's version with the kind of consistency that investigators, and journalists recognize as the signature of genuine memory rather than constructed narrative. The broader martial arts community began examining Seagal's claims with the tools that the internet age had made newly available. Journalists began requesting documentation for his Japan residency timeline. Historians of Japanese Aikido were asked about his claimed dojo. Former students described training environments that bore little resemblance to the lethal competence portrayed in his films. None of this proved that Seagal was a fraud in the comprehensive sense. His Aikido credentials remained legitimate. His decades of training represented genuine investment. He was not nothing, but what he had claimed to be, the deadly, invincible, untouchable operator whose techniques were lethal realities rather than cooperative demonstrations. That image had been challenged, tested, and found wanting, and in the community that had been shaped by Bruce Lee's influence. This carried a particular weight. To understand why the Seagal story matters beyond simple celebrity gossip, you have to understand what Bruce Lee actually built, and what it meant for the culture he left behind. Lee didn't just create a martial arts system. He created a philosophical framework for honest self-evaluation. He created a model of what an authentic warrior culture looks like, one built not on hierarchy and tradition and the protection of institutional prestige, but on the relentless, uncomfortable pursuit of what actually works. His students carried this forward. Dan Inosanto became one of the most respected martial arts instructors in the world. Known for his intellectual honesty, his willingness to train with practitioners of every background, his refusal to claim more than he could verify. Inosanto's students went on to become coaches for UFC champions, special operations military units, law enforcement agencies, places where the philosophical luxury of comfortable self-deception doesn't exist, because reality provides immediate, lethal feedback. Jeet Kune Do concepts became embedded, often without attribution, in the methodology of Brazilian jiu-jitsu schools that emphasized live rolling over cooperative drilling. They appeared in boxing gyms that adopted cross-training decades before the term entered common usage. They shaped the philosophical foundations of mixed martial arts competition in ways that the sports historians have only begun to fully document. When the UFC launched in 1993, 20 years after Bruce Lee's death, it validated every principle he had articulated. The fighters who thrived were not the ones with the most impressive traditional credentials. They were the ones who had been trained under genuine resistance, tested against opponents who didn't cooperate, forced to discover what they actually knew versus what they merely believed. The fighters who failed in the early UFC were often exactly the profile that the Seagal incident had exposed. Impressive looking, credentials heavy, trained in environments where partners cooperated and techniques were never genuinely stress-tested. Bruce Lee had predicted this outcome in 1967. The UFC proved it in 1993. Gene LaBelle demonstrated it in a Los Angeles production environment, on a date that witnesses have never been willing to specify precisely, with a man who had built a career on refusing to face this truth. Today, Bruce Lee's legacy is more secure than it has ever been. The MMA community has adopted him as a philosophical grandfather, the man who saw the future of combat sports before anyone else, who articulated the principles that the sport would vindicate, who insisted on honest testing in an era when comfortable mythology was the industry standard. His philosophy has been taught in universities. His personal journals have been published and studied. His training methods have been analyzed by sports scientists who have confirmed what his students always knew. He was, by the standards of any era, an extraordinary physical specimen with a genuine, pressure-tested fighting ability. Steven Seagal's legacy is more complicated. He is, at 72, still a public figure, though his public presence in recent years has become defined more by political controversy and legal accusations accusations he has denied, than by martial arts. The action film career that once made him a global brand has long since faded. The myths he constructed have been picked apart, challenged, and largely discredited in the communities whose respect he most wanted. He has never fully addressed the LaBelle incident on the record. He has threatened lawsuits. He has made angry denials. But the story persists, with the stubborn durability of things that are essentially true. In the martial arts world, there's a saying that was old before Bruce Lee was born. A man cannot hide behind his reputation when reality comes calling. Jean LaBelle was reality. The incident he described, whatever the precise details, whatever the specific words exchanged, whatever the exact sequence of events, represented something larger than one confrontation between two men. It represented the moment when a manufactured image met an honest system, and the honest system won, as honest systems always do. Bruce Lee built his entire life on this principle. He had faced his own honest reckonings in the 1964 challenge from Wong Jack Man, in the Hollywood rejections, in the physical limitations that injuries imposed on him in his final years. He had faced them, examined them, incorporated them, and emerged more capable each time. This was the difference. Not the speed, not the physique, not the technical perfection that witnesses described with reverence. The difference was the willingness to be tested honestly. And for 40 years. In dojos and gyms and green rooms and training camps across the world, the men and women who carry Bruce Lee's philosophy forward have told the story of what happened when a man who refused that willingness finally met someone who embodied it. There is a photograph that exists somewhere in private collections, in the memories of people who were present, of Bruce Lee and the stunt performers and martial artists he trained with in Hollywood during the late 1960s and early 1970s. In every account of these photographs, the same thing is described. Bruce Lee looks relaxed, comfortable, genuinely at ease in a way that you don't see in the posed performance-ready images from his films. Because he was surrounded by people who had tested him honestly, people who had tried to hit him and failed, people who had felt what he was actually capable of and respected him for what it actually was rather than what it appeared to be. He didn't need to claim anything. He had been tested. He had proved himself in the only way that ultimately matters. Honestly, under resistance, against people who were genuinely trying. The men who carry his legacy remember this. They remember the principle more than the techniques, the philosophy more than the forms. They remember that the highest expression of martial arts is not the impressive demonstration but the honest reckoning. And every time the story of that Los Angeles production environment circulates again, every time Jean LaBelle calmly, consistently confirms what happened, Bruce Lee's people smile, not because they take pleasure in another man's humiliation, but because the truth, as always, proved exactly what their teacher had always said it would prove. Only honesty survives contact with reality. Everything else eventually falls.